So I recently got into a big lot of quarter comics, and it was actually $40 if you fill a short box. So of course that's what I had to do. We're going to try to run through all of these. I ended up picking up 232 comics in total, which came out to a little bit less than 18 cents per book. And we'll see what I picked up there, see if there's any treasures in here. Caliber presents number 3 and 5 here. These both feature James O'Barr cover art. For some reason, he's going by Barbed Wire Halo Studios on this first appearance, and I don't know if that's other cartoonists or if that's just something that he was using as kind of a cool sounding name, but clearly this is James O'Barr art. And then the second story in this book is Heart of Darkness, Tim Vigil, inked by Tim Tyler, two artists we talked about in our Outlaw Comics edition. Caliber is a pretty interesting publisher. They published a lot of different comics, a lot of different cartoonists, and just really a lot of books over the years. One noteworthy piece in this is Ken Landgraf. He's another guy from the Outlaw Comics. Doesn't do a lot of stuff outside of self-publishing, so it's interesting when he makes an appearance like this, and this is his story here. Another issue of Caliber Presents, this one featuring Guy Davis's Baker Street. Guy Davis did a long series with Caliber called Baker Street, kind of a punk comic. Really great art. He was good from the get-go. I also picked up Baker Street number 2. I have number 1 from previous back issue diving. Date on this is 1989, so the tail end of the black and white explosion. Shatter, the first computerized comic. This is by art by Mike Seance. This is a one-shot that launched this concept, I suppose. Really great splash page. You can see kind of an homage there to Blade Runner. He was drawing this on a Macintosh computer. This is 1985 was publication date on this. It's funny, digital coloring is sort of where the computer really went with computer art in comics, at least at first. He was going the other way and doing the black and white line art, kind of the bitmap quality that you see there. And it looks like the lettering as well. So the first couple of issues of Shatter. Picked up a couple of issues from DC Comics. Sergio Aragone's solo title. I always pick up solos whenever I find them. These are just one-person anthologies that get to take advantage of the DC characters as well as showcase a little bit of, you know, whatever makes these guys worthy of their own anthology. So usually they feature several short stories, some featuring DC characters. Yeah, Peter Bagg and Gilbert Hernandez teaming up. This is Homage Comics. Kind of weird. Shelley Roberg, later Shelley Bond, is the editor, longtime Vertigo editor. This is 1999, so I'm not sure. I don't really remember Homage Comics. Homage Studios was Jim Lee's comics, but by the time DC acquired them, it was Wildstorm. So don't remember that imprint, but two great cartoonists. And Lobo Infanticide, Book 3. I have the other 3 issues in this 4-issue miniseries. Found this, figured I'd add it to my collection. This is Keith Giffen doing plotting and artwork, and this is around the era of Trencher. One of the more unique-looking comic book art styles, and you kind of get to see it blooming here. This is probably the first time that we've seen this line-heavy style that Giffen uses for a year or two. Very interesting. Not too many comics look like this. And a lot of the comics that I pick up, they catch my eye. Whenever you're paying, 17 or 18 cents a book and you have 100 boxes to go through, if they grab your attention, you throw them in the box, figure out later if it's something you want to keep or not. This looks a lot like those 90s Image comics that are so popular. The Hood, South Central LA. This is another example of a book that I have never heard of, but caught my eye. You can see the artwork's a little rougher. It may be produced by an artist who has not done comics before or is not as influenced by some of the what we think of as mainstream comics of that time, again, like the Image books. This is early 90s. Pretty interesting looking comic. I Had a Dream #1. Stephen Gilbert. Love the inking in this book. I think this is a beautiful looking book. 1995. I actually have a couple other issues of this comic that I've picked up, and whenever I come across an issue for that price, why not add it? Pretty fun to look at. A little reminiscent of some Charles Burns with some of the feathering and the inking. Avatar Chronicles. Never heard of this one. Mostly picked this up because it has Chaykin the Forever Man. Chaykin was a Sega Genesis game, but the cartoonist behind it came from Ohio, so I would see him at shows around the Pittsburgh area, and that's his character, Chaykin the Forever Man. I kind of like the drawing style in this. It's rough. Looks like it was drawn with a Uniball pen or something of that sort. The Man Called Axe, also known as A10. This is Bravura line from Malibu. This was their creator-owned line. This is contemporary of early Image comics, something like Marvel's Epic's Heavy Hitters. And I picked this up recently and really enjoyed it. You can see it's very much in this Image style, and a lot of creators were doing this thing where they seem to be deconstructing the Image house style and why it was popular, and I actually like some of those comics. Man Called Axe is probably my favorite of these, at least at the moment. And I have the entire series except issue 4, so it was fantastic to actually find the one I was missing. Bigfoot, IDW, Steve Niles, Rob Zombie, and Richard Corbin. Richard Corbin is my main interest in this book. I'm also a fan of Bigfoot, though, so seeing Richard Corbin doing a Bigfoot story sounds great to me. Plastic Forks, #4. This is one of those titles that I bought and then sold and now rebuy. 1990s, Ted McKeever doing watercolor, I believe, on top of his inks. Pretty good to see these guys that have like kind of a black and white indie background but also working in color. And McKeever's done a lot of color work and a lot of painted comics, and you can see all of that on display here. You know, he was pretty great from the get-go. Anybody who watches this channel regularly knows that I'm interested in the 1980s black and white explosion in self-publishing and small publishing. One of the more interesting publishers of this era is Chris Silver. Chris Silver did Greater Mercury Comics. This is the second publishing imprint that he ran. The first one was Silver Wolf. Their most popular title was Grips. We've talked about that before. Grips' first several issues were drawn by Tim Vigil. This is a later run. This is not Tim Vigil art, but it's a very violent vigilante type comic. Very successful for Greater Mercury and for Silver Wolf, and so they published quite a few of these. Grips Adventures, which you would think is Legion 2, but it's not. It's actually Grips Adventure #1. Kind of collecting these, especially whenever I find them at a good price or in a discount bin. If you like Grips and, you know, violent vigilante comics, there's a lot to offer. Silver Wolf was full of these kinds of books like Psychopath. Here's another title, Dragon Quest, and this first issue also features Tim Vigil art. Pretty odd publisher. I think in some ways this is some of the worst quality comics of that era, but they were very prolific. There's something of a universe there, and it's just interesting to me as a cartoonist to see these efforts. Eradicators was one of their popular titles. They ran through several volumes. Legion X, pretty nice cover there. Fantastic Fables. They were strange for sure. Tink, kind of an oddball. And speaking of oddballs, one of the strange objects they do is their talent search. This does not feature any of that talent. It just tells you what they're looking for and gives some examples of what you should send them if you want to try to get some work with them. A contemporary publisher of theirs in the black and white scene was Solson. They were around 86, 87, didn't last very long, did a lot of work with artist Rich Buckler. That's the artist of this ad. And so this actually does print some of, I guess, the submissions that they received from different artists. So, you know, all of these black and white publishers during the black and white explosion needed artists and talent to put out product. So they would solicit talent searches, something we would see later from Image Comics in the early 90s during that boom. Speaking of big runs of comics, Kamui, A Genuine Ninja Story. This is published by Eclipse and Viz Comics together. I think they published close to 40 issues of this. Kamui's an old manga series. It started out in Garo. These are actually from a second volume. I forget the name of the anthology that they ran in Japan. But they're just beautiful comics. This is a contemporary of Mai for when it was brought to America in a translated form. And it's just a big epic set in Edo period Japan. This is a series that I'm actually considering binding. I've started hand binding books kind of as a hobby, something fun to do. And I think that this series, I'd like to do a longer comic the next time I bind something. And Kamui to me seems perfect. I think it's beautiful, and I think it would look amazing in a giant hardcover collection. So I've been buying Kamuis for a while, and I probably have a couple of these issues already, but I'm getting close to a complete run. And who knows, maybe you'll see a video in the near future of that binding process. Another Tim Vigil comic, this one by North Star. Vigil's art ran through quite a few black and white comics of the 80s and 90s. This layout in particular reminds me of Todd McFarlane would often do in his Spider-Man, and sometimes in Spawn, would do kind of the profile of the character and then have panels running down the side behind that profile face. Love some of this lettering effects. Another 80s publisher, Aircel, they started publishing around 1986 as well. They published for quite a while and quite a few series. Ultimately, they were acquired or merged with Malibu, and of course, Marvel eventually buys Malibu, so I assume these titles are now property of Marvel. I assume. I could be wrong. Aircel's a funny story. They start out as a heating cooling company, like an insulation company in Canada, and I guess whenever they had some troubles, Barry Blair, one of the employees, convinced them to start publishing comics. Dragon Ring #1, Volume 2. This is drawn by Guan Yap. Probably mispronouncing that name. I apologize, Mr. Yap. But these are great because they're in color, which was really rare for these mid-'80s, late '80s indie publishers. It's pretty unusual to see them in color. I love that panel. I think it looks really great. And then the other piece in this book that's noteworthy is Dragonfly, featuring the artwork of a very young Dave Cooper, also doing full-color art. I think this stuff is done probably with markers. You can see some of the, what I assume are the strokes of the markers in this art. This is another example of early Dave Cooper art. It's from early 90s, so probably about 4 or 5 years after the Dragon Ring, but still relatively early if you think of his work from something like Weasel or some of his painted work that's been showing in galleries lately. One thing I'd call attention to here is the lettering. Very unusual lettering style. Pretty unusual layouts too. Dave Cooper's a cartoonist I really admire, so it's fun to see him go through these phases as he develops. Another Aircel comic, also in color. Love this splash page. This is Barry Blair and Pat McKeown. And Samurai also ran as a black and white series for a very long time. This is probably one of Aircel's flagship titles, if you can say that. Stark Future was a science fiction series that Aircel published. This is more in line with the black and white 80s comics that I often follow and track down. This artist is Jim Somerville. He did a few things for Aircel. I like his work just fine. Stark Future is a sci-fi series that ran for double-digit number of issues, so I've slowly been buying those whenever I come across them. You'll see a lot of ninja comics from the 80s, and it's hard for me to pass those up. This one reminds me a lot of Jademan comics. Jademan comics are another staple of 80s, 90s comics that you can find, and they are Hong Kong comics that were translated and published in the US. This looks almost exactly like a Jademan comic. I don't know about credits and any crossover between the two companies. For all I know, this is another version of Jademan, maybe one that didn't work or one that was done for legal reasons or something. I don't really know the story behind this. I've seen a couple of comics from this publisher, but they're nowhere as prolific as Jademan. And it's funny, it says, the only comic to teach you real kung fu and ninja applications. So if you skip to the back, you can see some of those examples. I love this. Wrong, wrong, wrong. I'm not sure what this is. 50 cents, #1, self-published kind of comic, but from 1977, so not part of the black and white explosion, but I think in the same vein. And the art looks really good in this, in my opinion. One of my favorite things about digging through these quarter boxes is you find these comics that you don't know or haven't heard of, and, you know, in a lot of cases, there's not much written about them. This is a Tad Martin comic. This is an alternative comic that's been around for sort of a while. We've shown some past issues of this. This one's all prose, so kind of a disappointment. I like the comics that I've seen of Tad Martin in the past. Average American Teenager. Alpha and Omega, Al Hartley, Spire. These are Christian comics. Al Hartley's published quite a few of these over the course of comics history, probably for a decade or two in the 70s and 80s. And they're novelties. I pick them up whenever I see them because of their strangeness. This one actually looks fairly straightforward, although some of the page layouts I think are pretty good, pretty fun to look at. He definitely gets outside of that grid and gets into some collages and montage styles. This is one of those oddballs. I have no idea what this is. There's 23 of them, which is shocking, I suppose. This is from Canada, 1994. The cartooning looks pretty good. 9-panel grids, very tight drawing. Haven't had a chance to read it yet, though, so we'll see what it's about. Nice paper, too. It's on what feels like a newsprint. Inviso World. I had never heard of this one before. Published by Eternity, 1987, and it's all sound effects and lettering. There's no art in here, just words. I'll be honest, I love how this one looks. I once thought about doing a zine that would be all sound effects, found sound effects, things clipped out of comic books, kind of to show the innovative lettering. I used to have dinner with Ron Friends regularly, and a couple of the other guys that were like previous generation of cartoonists, and they would refer to all of the lettering in comics as calligraphy, and I always loved that. I thought that was the greatest description for this stuff. Time Warriors, The Beginning. Looks like your standard black and white 80s comic until you get inside of it and see that it's in color. Feels like a strange choice to make that cover black and white. Since they are in color inside, this really would stand out in the 80s black and white explosion era, but there you go. Heavy Armor. This is something I picked up based on the cover. Nothing too special inside, pretty standard. I always pick up things like Amazing Heroes, Comic Reader. These are zines, fanzines, comics magazines. This one, 1982. These, I believe, are 1987, and they do comics news, usually features and interviews, reviews, solicitations of what's coming out or coming up. So they're kind of fun. They're snapshots of that particular era. Certainly pre-internet, this was a way, you know, comics fans could kind of keep up with what's coming out, what they're looking forward to, maybe learn a little bit about the artists and writers that they like. And the Staros Report, 1997. This is Chris Staros, who would go on to be the publisher, founder, and publisher of Top Shelf Comics. He used to publish these annual reports, very similar in content and idea to these other fanzines, basically celebration of comics. He would focus on things like the top comics of the year, or the top comics overall. This is a list of 100 of the best comics. Pretty fun, little description of each. He would also publish comics in these. This is Eddie Campbell. Of course, there was a long relationship between Campbell and Top Shelf. They might still publish, but they've published so many of his comics. So this is almost like a classic fanzine. It's just by 1997, production values were desktop publishing. Things were in very neat order. So Detour #1 by Ed Brubaker. Ed Brubaker, of course, goes on to be a very celebrated writer at Marvel and DC Comics. In the 90s, he was both a writer and an artist and did a lot of this alternative style comics. So you come across these from time to time in back issue bins. Kind of an oddity, but good cartoonist, good storyteller. Fun to see where he came from. Gnome Legends. This one is an oddball book. This comes out of Alabama. I always like to see where these comics are published and imagine what the comic scenes look like in these different locations. One of the great parts of comics and comics making is that the budget is so low to produce a comic book, there's virtually no barrier to entry. So when you get into these self-published comics, you find all sorts of origins as to where they come from. I don't have a lot of comics from Alabama, so this is my sample for what was going on in Alabama. And I believe this is the 1988. So during the 80s black and white boom, this is what was coming out of Alabama cartoonists. Oat Willie, this is Gilbert Shelton and a few other underground artists, including Jackson. Underground comics are something I have not read enough of. I don't see them as often, so anytime I see an underground comic in a back issue, in a 50-cent bin or quarter bin, I grab it. Gilbert Shelton, from Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and Wonder Warthog. He's one of my favorite of the undergrounds, and Jackson is a guy who would do some early nonfiction comics and was published by Fantagraphics early on in their history. I think they both came out of Texas. Blade of the Immortal. Blade of the Immortals are just fun to read, so if you get them at a reading price, I will often pick these up whenever I find them cheap. They're pretty interesting because they're not flipped. A lot of, they're Japanese comics that have been translated here in English. They're not flipped. A lot of the Japanese comics will be flipped from right to left. This cartoonist or publisher did not want that to happen, so they still read in the Western style of left to right reading, but I believe the way they do it is they actually cut up the original pages and reorient them so that the panels are arranged in the proper order to be read left to right. It can create some strange reading rhythms where a lot of the flow is sort of going opposite of the reading direction. At first, it's jarring, but once you read a couple of pages, you kind of get really deeply into it. And I find this with a lot of different comic styles, things like very tight grids like Dave Lapham's Stray Bullets with its 8-panel grid. I just get sucked into that storytelling very quickly. Another example is Brian Chippendale does a storytelling method where the panels read almost like a snake. So you start on the left and go across and then down, and then you go right to left and down and left to right. And because you're so close, you never pull back to kind of reset your eyes. You get sucked into that storytelling. This stuff looks great, though. I think this is a beautiful series, and I know a lot of my friends who are very influenced and into Blade of the Immortal. So there's a lot of those. You find them in discount bins, and always a fun pickup. I mentioned Solson earlier. This is Rich Buckler, Solson. This is a book I've never picked up before, but see a lot. I thought it was kind of like a quickie cartoon style, but whenever I flip through it, this is another one of those books where the inside does not seem to line up with what's on the cover. Some kind of a comedy series. Looks pretty good to me. Speed Racer Classics. Speed Racer is great because it's car comics. I always want to do chase scenes and try to figure out like dynamic stuff, especially with Street Angel running around the streets and people chasing her. And it can be hard to do motion in comics. I feel like manga has more examples of this, from like Akira has some great chase scenes, but Speed Racer is really awesome for that. And one of the great things with these Speed Racer comics, besides growing up watching Speed Racer cartoons and thus being a Speed Racer fan, these things were packaged in like, I don't know, 80 pages or something at a very cheap, affordable rate. And so you get like a big block of comics and a lot of fun, a lot of motion and racing. Piranha is Loose, #2. 1991. Artist on this is Peter Grau. I'm not familiar with his name, but his art style leads me to believe that he would do mainstream work if that's what he wanted. It's very polished. You know, it seems very accomplished, like what you would see at a DC or a Marvel Comics. So I don't know if he has a longer career or not, but I picked this up because you have a character named Piranha with razor sharp teeth. Tales of the Bean World. We've talked about this on a Palmer's Picks episode. This is Larry Marder's absolutely bizarre comic series about the beans and how they survive, and it kind of defies description, which is what you read a lot whenever you read about Bean World. Anytime I find these, I pick them up. I've gotten a few over the years. Very fun read. Definitely challenges what my conceptions are of comics. Warlash. This is 1994. This is just the kind of independent black and white comics, borderline outlaw comics. Guy getting a knife through the face. Maybe it's not borderline. But the obsessive kind of rendering, you know, probably what you're seeing on screen, it's almost just grayness because of all the hatching and lines and scratchy art. One Millennium. Strange comic, strange cover, funny text. This is right up my alley, and I love this spaceship. I think that's a great 2-page spread. The Spider Presents Quiver. 1994. If you notice, the cover's kind of knockoff image style, lots of rendering, big muscles, gritting teeth. But the inside is Gray Morrow, longtime comic book artist going back into the 70s. This would probably be some of his latest, you know, late work. So I picked this up mostly on the name of Gray Morrow and just out of curiosity. I don't know what this image is, super bizarre. But I also like the motorcycles, so it's kind of fun that the heroine rides around on a motorcycle. I was digging through these comics with my friend Frank Santoro, another cartoonist. Fun to go digging with friends because you can always kind of pull out books you like but already have and pass them off to each other and try to kind of like show off, or you know, you learn a lot about comics this way, where somebody knows more than you do and they're kind of like recommending this or that person. I was unfamiliar with Ring of Roses, but this is one that Frank pulled out and kind of handed off to me. Looks great. I don't know if this is a European artist. It kind of reminds me of some of the import stuff that I've seen, but really strong black and white work. Always nice whenever you can find a whole series as well. Another early manga import. This is Eclipse. They did a lot of manga. You know, they were one of those companies in the 80s that was importing manga. And this is, of course, from the creator of Ghost in the Shell. Happy Hour in America, Volume 2, Number 1. This is by Tim Lane. Tim Lane is a cartoonist. This is published by Fantagraphics. Tim Lane is an amazing cartoonist, and he's working on this, I guess it's a biography about Steve McQueen. So that's what you're seeing here. I'm so impressed by like his lettering, extremely rigorous drawing style. He's done a few books with Fantagraphics. I actually was on a panel with him in Brooklyn a couple years ago, and just very impressed with his cartooning and storytelling. Amazing draftsman. This is fun. Jaime Hernandez Mechanics, number 1. We recently got a box of comics from Jay McWerns, thanks Jay, and that included Mechanics number 2, which I didn't have. So seeing issue number 1, fun to pick it up. Fun to see this old Love and Rockets comics in color. You know, this was originally published in Love and Rockets, the first couple of issues in black and white. So it's pretty neat to see how this stuff looks in color. Ho Chi Anderson and Wilfred Santiago teaming up on Pop Life. Anthology from Fantagraphics. Pretty fun to look through. These are both guys who are extremely strong graphically. Chance to see them experimenting a little bit. Some neat 2-color printing, something you don't see a lot of in comics. This is one of those great black and white mid-80s kind of books, Protectors number 2. And this one is really fun because it's drawn, they must have planned on doing this as like a magazine because it's drawn with a lot of space at the bottom, you know, the margins. So the creators took this space. Apparently they had some issues between the publication of issue 1 and the publication of issue 2, and they go through and note what those issues were, mostly with their previous publisher, and kind of amazing. It's like a director's commentary, except it's very critical of their collaborators. So very 80s looking comic on the top, and then maybe a peek behind the curtain on the bottom. This is a fun one if you come across it. Here are the Marvel comics that I came home with. A couple issues of Critical Mass. I've been buying these on and off because of Jorge Zaffino, and I think he's in maybe 4 or 5 of these, and they're pretty substantial, his stories. They're like 20 pages or so. Jorge Zaffino we've talked about in the past. I think he's Argentinian, I'm going to say, although I'll probably be wrong now that I've said it. But he's a cartoonist that did some work for Marvel in the 80s, and he died young, so he doesn't have a lot of work available in English. As such, whenever you find something by him, I recommend you pick it up and give it a look. Very good with a brush, very good with black and white and value and texture. One of the better artists, I think, that have come through Marvel. And like I said, not a lot of work available, so whenever you find it, highly recommend picking that up. And he is in at least 4 issues of Critical Mass. Beavis and Butthead. So, of course, I'm a Beavis and Butthead fan, but the reason I buy the Beavis and Butthead comics is because they're drawn by Rick Parker. Rick Parker is a longtime Marvel letterer. I think he's a fantastic letterer. You can see him kind of showing off a little bit here. His lettering always is a little more cartoony and expressive, I think, than your standard, some of his peers. But in Beavis and Butthead, he's also drawing the comic, and it ran for probably, I don't know, a couple years. So there's quite a bit of this, but it's the main cartooning outlet of Rick Parker that I'm aware of. And whenever I find these issues, I pick them up because I think he's a good cartoonist, and it's pretty fun to read these and see their little adventures and what they're doing. Rick Parker did a lot of lettering over Todd McFarlane on Spider-Man. G.I. Joe 30. I pick up G.I. Joes sometimes whenever I find them. I've started doing that lately. There's some interesting ones. I don't have a lot of G.I. Joe comics, but I have things like the Silent issue, first appearance of Sergeant Slaughter, Todd McFarlane's issue. So in a lot of ways, I think G.I. Joe could be compared to X-Men in that Larry Hama kind of creates this big ensemble cast and really writes it long enough that those characters change and evolve, and pretty good storytelling over the course of the series. Infernal Man-Thing. This is Steve Gerber and Kevin Nolan. I like Kevin Nolan a lot. This is a series that goes back to, I think, the 80s when they were working on this. Steve Gerber, creator of Howard the Duck, had a very inventive mind. Also wrote a lot of G.I. Joe cartoons. But this is a series that I guess they had started working on, and for whatever reason, it was never completed until like the 2000s, I think, is when this finally saw publication. Really interesting art, you know, like these cartoony characters. I don't know how this is painted, if that's airbrushed or what the color is, but Kevin Nolan doing some work that doesn't look like anything else exactly that he's done. Venom, Lethal Protector. I picked this up because this was a book I had when it came out in the early 90s. I got rid of it, and I decided I wanted to give it another look, so 17 cents was the right price for me. And I expected to be kind of pulled back into this, like nostalgia, but it doesn't really do too much for me, unfortunately. How about some mini comics? These are the smaller books that I picked up. This one is neat. It's on newsprint. I have no idea how this was printed. It seems like it must have been a promotion for some kind of local drive-in movie theater, something or other. Features a werewolf character. Murder Falcon. This is Daniel Warren Johnson. I like Daniel Warren Johnson a lot. He did Extremity, and now he's doing Murder Falcon as part of Skybound imprint at Image Comics. And I guess Image, or at least Skybound, does these little ash cans for promotion. Very cool to see this. It's kind of a throwback to those early Image books of the 92, 93. They often would do little ash cans. So pretty cool to see Daniel Warren Johnson's art in black and white at this size. Very fun book. Dark Wolf #1, The Hell Warrior. I'm not sure the publisher of this, but they have they do several other titles. One that I know is Doberman, so he's like part Doberman and part person. And it's printed the same way, where like a signature or the first several pages are printed with non-black ink, and then there's a chunk that is just regular black ink, what you would expect, and then more. I had somebody suggest this was a risograph, and I suppose that's popular, but I actually think in the 80s there were these photocopy machines you could use that would print in color. Red, green, blue, I think were the main colors that you could use. And if you look, there's some streakiness on this. Same with the black, almost certainly this is photocopy. And so I'm guessing that's how these were printed, but it's pretty unusual look. And Butch Burcham and Dark Wolf. Dark Wolf goes through several iterations. You can find this published by a lot of different publishers. Jenks, I've never heard of. Jenks number 2, to be more specific. California book, 1986, weird size. And I like this artwork quite a lot. I'm looking forward to reading this one. It's kind of science fiction-y and just looks different and fairly attractive. This is the selection of Image comics that I picked up. I know what you're thinking. This first one's not Image. No, it's not. It's Revolutionary Comics. They did a lot of the unauthorized rock and roll biographies. This is 1992, so this is right in the beginning of Image Comics. And parody's not quite the right word for it, but I think the artwork for this is really great. Like the caricature of the Image guys, Geraldo Rivera, even with the broken nose. Stan Lee. I think this one looks fantastic. I was very excited to pick this up. Looking forward to reading it. I grabbed these 1963s. This is another project that I'm planning to bind. And so I'm new to book binding. I like to have backups. I hate to destroy my original comics, especially with something like 1963 that's such a good series. So pick those up cheap to maybe make a hardcover book out of. Crimson, Huberto Ramos. This is a vampire series. It was part of the Cliffhanger imprint that included Danger Girl and Joe Madureira's Battle Chasers. There might have been another book in that lineup. I think this one ran the longest. I think this ran like, man, 20 issues or more compared to those other titles that were only like 7 or 8. Picked up the first 3 of those. They look good. We'll see what it's like. Bulletproof Coffin, Disinterred. I believe this is the second series of Bulletproof Coffin. I picked this up because it's Shaky Kane. Shaky Kane is an artist that I found out about from Deadline magazine. Very pop art. He has a Kirby influence. I think these covers stand out great too. Very bright and colorful. Very steeped in like comics mythology, if that makes sense. You know, cartoony. Flat colors for the most part. Bright colors. Simple shapes. Bizarre subject matter. Everything I love in a comic. Ascension, Dave Finch, and Bat the Inker. Somebody having an arm ripped off. Inside Image. Inside Image, these are basically Image's promo magazine that they published themselves. This is Gen 13, but it was still called Gen X when it was originally announced. And I guess Marvel must have put the kibosh on that, I'm guessing. But this is before they changed the name to Gen 13. Dark Sector Zero. Bill Sienkiewicz. Top Cow, so I guess it's Image Comics. Top Cow being Mark Silvestri's imprint. And this is from 2007. So Bill Sienkiewicz, one of my favorite cartoonists. Fun to see him working, outside of that 80s, 90s. When I think of his peak, interesting to see him doing something a little newer. And I believe he's doing everything in terms of the art here, both color and line work. Arachnus number 3. Not Image Comics, but clearly influenced by Image Comics. Amazon, Dark Horse comic. This is Tim Sale and Steven Siegel writing. Tim Sale probably came on my radar whenever he started drawing Deathblow for Image. Probably a lot of viewers might know him from all of his work on Batman, Long Halloween, and the series around that. Everett Hartsoe's Razor. This is one of those phenom books from the 90s. One of the books that really started the bad girl craze or capitalized on it. And in this intro page, he mentions Aeon Flux from MTV's Liquid Television being an influence on the style of this character and the look of this character. I'm a big fan of Aeon Flux, so kind of cool to see that called out. Brink of Destruction looks like your typical bad girl comics, but whenever you flip through it, I found the artwork to be really attractive and interesting and fit that outsider kind of art that I like the eyeballs. I think this is based on an actress, and so it was probably supposed to be maybe something that would turn into a movie. It might be a movie for all I know. I have no idea. It was the first time I heard of it. Bionic Woman, obviously a licensed property. When you start looking at these old comics, you'll find almost everything you've ever heard of has a comic book version. Valkyrie. Picked this up for Paul Galassi. Very attractive art. Obviously, Galassi, you know, a lot of us are into him from his time in Masters of Kung Fu, but a relatively prolific artist. Another 80s book by him that is one of my favorites is Slash Maraud. This character's great, though. Love the helmet. He could easily be a character in Slash Maraud. I've never heard of Taser number 4, but I picked this up. She has a blade, very similar to Grips. This is 1993, even though it looks like it should be 1988. Barbie Twin Adventures. Guest appearance by Everett Hartsoe's Razor. This is Topps Comics, early 90s. And it's mostly painted. Kind of fun to see the painted art. Pretty strange book for Topps, I think. But then again, I don't really know how I would define Topps Comics. Trina Robbins, California Girls. A lot of Eclipse books, if you're paying attention. Trina Robbins, sort of a Hall of Fame cartoonist, comics historian. You know, she's worked at Marvel, DC, as well as Underground Comics going back into the 70s. So really noteworthy cartoonist. I think this is an attractive looking book. Figured I would give it a shot. Space 342434. This is the Nova Girls. You may recognize this. It may look familiar if you checked out our wrestling comic special. The Nova Girls were also featured in that. They did a comic called Kissing Canvas, and it's the same kind of fumetti, part photograph, part drawn. Just bizarre. You know, this is one of those oddball 80s books. Can't pass that up for 17 cents. 64 pages, no less. Fun that the lettering, the numbers change into that digital. And they also misspell the for the end. Here's a good series. So Whisper, the main creator behind this is the writer Stephen Grant, and this ran for something like almost 40 issues across a couple of publishers in the 80s, and it's a full color series. Different artists worked on this. One of the artists that was around for a while was Norm Brayfogle, who did Prime at Ultraverse and Batman and Detective Comics for a while. I like Norm Brayfogle a lot, so Whisper is a ninja woman. I love this cover, and he does a few of those covers, kind of this long, elongated figure, very dark, shadowy covers painted. These remind me of Elektra, and they're pretty interesting. Besides being, you know, ninja comics, which I love, they're also almost like period, at this point, like period pieces of the 80s. So you get to see like fashion, at least some attention to fashion. The other artist in this run that I picked up is Spider, and he draws the rest of this stack that I'm going to be flipping through. Noteworthy is Bruce Timm is colorist on several of these books as well. Of course, Bruce Timm goes on to Batman the Animated Series just a couple years later. These will cover 1988, 1989, so You know, Batman the Animated Series is 1992. So Bruce Timm goes from coloring these ninja comics to doing the best version of Batman ever. Some really great covers. I think that one's a good one. Pretty fun. And like I said, one of the side benefits once you get into these comics from the 80s is you do see fashions and things that if I were doing a book set in the 80s, it would be a lot of hard work for me to figure out fashion. But for this stuff, it's just kind of taken for granted. I'm sure they were just looking at whatever they saw in magazines and TV and movies at the time. But it makes for a pretty fun read and a pretty fun flip through. Wild Seed, never heard of it. Look kind of cool. Fred Hembeck destroys the Marvel Universe. Fred Hembeck was a guy that was around a lot when I was a kid. He would often do kind of like an editorial page in some of the Marvel books. And, you know, he's a humor artist. It's a very funny Punisher. So this is him poking fun at the Marvel Universe and basically a chance to see him draw a lot of the Marvel characters in his style. Hirobi, horror manga. From Jay McCarron's generous donation, I picked up the second book of this. Whenever I came across the first book, I figured I should start there. It definitely looks like a fun read, and I love that cat. So this is one I'm looking forward to diving into. Epsilon Wave, published out of Texas in '86. These are basically what you would expect out of black and white Boom comics with one giant exception. They are in color. I love this character too. It reminds me of an early Cable with the metal arm. This ran for at least 8 issues because this is issue number 8 here. I've been picking these up slowly whenever I come across them, just out of my interest in 80s comics. As I said, they're noteworthy because they are in color and they're pretty well done. You know, for an independent publisher, they do a very good job pulling these off, and possibly a candidate for me to bind into a book at some point. Magic Man. Lots of comics are reprints. This is art by Pete Costanza, but the lettering reminds me of Ogden Whitney, going back to American Comics. I forget their publisher, but Ogden Whitney's a creator that I'm a fan of. You may know him from Herbie, the Fat Fury. He also did a lot of romance comics that are coming out in a new collection later this year that we'll take a look at. But Ogden Whitney, his comics feature this exact same lettering, and it makes me wonder if I always thought this was Whitney, and maybe he's lettering other titles, or maybe there's a letter that I'm not giving credit to. But these are nice-looking comics. Fang. Good cover. Pretty fun insides. This is 1993. It would probably fit a little better in like 1988, although this character's face reminds me a lot of Rob Liefeld art at the time, so I guess it's somewhat contemporary to the early 90s. And I don't know if Fang's a werewolf or not, but here are a couple of werewolf comics from the 80s. First of all, Werewolf Blackthorn, one of the 80s black and white publishers, fairly prolific at the time. And Nathan Impaler Monster Hunter Werewolf Special. Hall of Heroes presents Sinister. Hall of Heroes was a publisher that gave a lot of young cartoonists a start. Books like Vortex came out of there. Calvin. This is part of a title by Marvel Comics 1972 called Little Kids. I was unfamiliar with this one. This is probably, I guess, when comics were made for kids. So this is kind of an anthology of kids' comics, it looks like. Little Lana, and this character is basically like a syndicated character named Henry. So I don't know if that's just a ripoff of Henry or what. Titan. Music City Comics. This is published out of Tennessee. These are kind of typical of some of the black and white comics, especially the superhero type comics, where you can almost see the influences from the mainstream guys, you know, the Kirbys and Ramitas and Buscemas and stuff. Gore Shriek, horror comic, published by Fanico, company out of Albany, New York. They were a comic shop. They might still be a comic shop and an independent publisher. There were a lot of independent publishers in the 80s in the black and white boom that were also comic shops. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, they were familiar with distro, and also they had access to, you know, comic book or aspiring comic book artists that's where I met a lot of my friends at the comic shop. So Dark Horse Comics starts out that way, but a lot of shops kind of dabbled or did some publishing. Terrorist. This is Heavy Hitters Epic Comics, early 90s, early episode of our Wizard coverage. This artist, John Erasmus, was mentioned in one of the comments from our viewers. I was curious to check him out, and whenever I came across this book and did a flip through, I figured throw it in my box. Pretty interesting art, painted style. I don't know how much comics this guy did, but definitely interesting enough for me to bring this home and give it a closer read. Love the coloring. Waldo World, Book 2. This is the great cartoonist Kim Deitch. Can't pass up a Kim Deitch comic whenever you find it in these back issues. He was one of the first like alternative underground cartoonists that I came across and have been a fan of ever since. Really love his comics. Very interesting sensibility and a very rigorous and attractive style. Of course, Waldo, the mischievous cartoon-like cat. Joe Matt's Peep Show. This is another alternative comic that I came across early in my reading. Joe Matt is kind of part of the Canadian trio of Chester Brown, who was doing Yummy Fur at this time, and then Seth, who was doing Palookaville. And occasionally they would do Jam Comics, and I guess they must have I think they were all based in Toronto and were all friendly with each other, and Drawn and Quarter published all of them. So, a couple of issues of Matt Wagner's Grendel. The one on the right, Wagner is writing and drawing, and it's basically a graphic novel. I think this is a two-parter. I only have one issue of that here, but it's all laid out in this very dense 25 panel per page grid. Interesting way to tell a story. You know, Wagner's one of those innovative cartoonists, very design conscious, good looking book, fun pickup. And then Grendel number 9, noteworthy because it's a wordless comic for the most part. Written by Wagner, drawn by the Pander brothers. I like wordless comics. I think they're interesting, good way to study storytelling. And you don't see that many of them, so noteworthy when you come across one. And that's Grendel number 9. Speaking of wordless comics, Concrete Earth Day 1990. This is a pretty amazing find. Paul Chadwick is the cartoonist behind Concrete, so you get a color Concrete story by him. Charles Vess, a very celebrated cartoonist, but the reason I'm excited is because this features a Mobius story. This is the Charles Vess piece. Beautiful, beautiful art, of course, what you would expect from Charles Vess. But the Mobius story is noteworthy because it's 23 pages, it's full color, and it's wordless as well. So a pretty substantial Mobius story to find in the middle of this Concrete comic. I did not realize it was this much of a story. Always beautiful colors whenever you see Mobius color work. Such a treat. This is not Mobius, but somebody highly influenced by Mobius, Gary Davis. This is Star Jongler. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. 1986 book. A friend of mine had kind of turned me on to these. Really nice artwork. Like I said, clearly influenced by Mobius, but a very nice book to flip through and to look at. T-1, I would rather call it Star Bikers. These are by the Day Brothers. I love that cover. The artwork inside's pretty good. Goon Show. It's a series of short stories. This one's pretty unusual. Sam Deuce Private Eye here, but some of the artwork is just a little bizarre. Like this pose, I think, is kind of weird. Fun to look at. Love that cover, though. Really great. Silver Wing. The artist in this book is Mark A. Nelson, who I think of from the first Dark Horse Alien miniseries. And his artwork, you know, it's the same kind of approach, using that duo shade or duotone board to create the grays. Very attractive. And if you like that Alien series, this is very much in that vein, art-wise. Ms. PMS, I have an issue of this. I believe there must be 2 issues of this, because I think I have a different issue that has a lot more of this kind of like full-page typography design strangeness. You can see a little bit of it on the title page here. And this is published out of Missouri. So again, pretty unusual where some of these comics originate. This was a good find. Dr. Wortham's Comics and Stories. I mentioned the Undergrounds. This is an example of maybe self-published underground comics. It's a little bit of a different aesthetic than you would see in terms of the production. I don't know if these are offset or not, but it's a heavier paper stock than most comics. And these are from the 70s. This first one is all the work of one artist. The second one is an anthology, and it's noteworthy because it's some of the early Joe Kubert School students, such as Steve Bissette and Rick Veitch. So that's some early Steve Bissette work here. And I think this is the Rick Veitch story, if I'm not mistaken. That's a very unusual find. I've seen those online, but never in person. Revolver. This is Robin Snyder, a longtime collaborator of Steve Ditko, mostly a collaborator in terms of publishing and distribution and sales of Steve Ditko's self-published work. This is 1985 and 1986, and primarily it's Steve Ditko. That's the reason I picked these up. They are anthologies, so there are some other cartoonists in these, but Ditko is definitely my reason for interest. This is one of those random 80s black and white comics. I think that's great. I don't know anything about this. You know, it was something that the cover caught my eye, and I grabbed it. And honestly, this is about what I hope for in some of those 80s self-published black and white books. Pretty fun, pretty strange. Twist number 1, Peter Bagg, Friedman Brothers, Basil Wolverton, John Holmstrom, Robert Williams, and Dan Clowes. That's a heck of a lineup. There's some Dan Clowes. Looks like that might have been aimed at a magazine-sized issue of Lloyd Llewellyn. Basil Wolverton. Pretty amazing. Another alternative anthology, this one, Anything Goes by Fantagraphics. My main reason for picking this one up is a Dan Clowes story in color. This is 1986, so pretty early for Dan Clowes and for Dan Clowes in color. I'm not sure if this appears anywhere else or if it's been collected or reprinted anywhere. Love all his lettering, though. It's always a highlight. From one Cerebus cover to another, Cerebus Jam number 1. Cerebus was probably the height of its powers, mid-80s. So this is Dave Sim and some of his buddies working together with the character Cerebus. I love the cover. Bill Sienkiewicz. Man, that guy drew every cover in the 1980s, I think. Low Society, a bit of a parody of Cerebus and Dave Sim. Here are a bunch of books that are, some are blatant ripoffs of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Some not as much, but they kind of all fit into that category. Interplanetary Lizards of the Texas Plains. Techno Toad. Some of them look very nice. Naive Interdimensional Commando Koalas. So these are Australian, which means they're upside down if you're reading this in North America, I guess, or the Northern Hemisphere. Kind of a clever conceit. You know, all the lettering is right side up, so kind of silly. Rock and Rollin' Minor Ants and Cyborg Gerbils, which I think was a UK book, if I'm not mistaken. Trigon. Yeah, this is published out of England, so even the English are trying to get in on that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle popularity. More parodies. Bland Man. This is a Bill Mouse book. And Cyberfems. Cyberfems confusing because it looks like Wildcats, but it sounds sort of like Cyberforce. But I don't think they care. How about some Dark Knight parodies? Midnight Skulker #2, Pork Knight, and Laughin' Gas. The Laughin' Gas one I think is maybe the best of this bunch. But I don't know. I haven't read them yet, so hard for me to say which one is the best. Seems like mostly just a Batman parody. Some of these parody the 16 panel grid, and some don't. That was part of the Dark Knight. Speaking of Dark Knight, how about some Frank Miller? Sin City Hell and Back, #7. I quit buying Sin City in the middle of Hell and Back. I can't tell you exactly why. It might have cost too much, or I didn't feel I was getting my money's worth, or I don't know what. It's 20 years ago. But this issue is color, so that's kind of cool. And then once you start going through it, it's not just color, but it's all these different influences and characters, and seems like a really great issue. I have since picked up most of this series, maybe all of this series now, so I may go back and reread this in its entirety. It's pretty interesting to see some of these characters and to see Miller visiting some of these characters. In one case, I believe there's a picture of Elektra, and it's probably the last time he drew Elektra in a comic book, I would imagine. So, pretty fun. Picked up a couple of issues of Destroyer Duck that I needed, including one with the Frank Miller cover. Destroyer Duck is another book that's on my short list of possible comic books to collect into a hardbound handmade book. Rain 1 and 2 and the Jam #1, all published by Tundra. Tundra's a company that's really caught my imagination as we've gone back through these Wizard magazines, looking at the early 90s comics and the comic scene of that time. Tundra's one of the more interesting publishers of that era, so whenever I see Tundra comics, I pick them up. Luther Arkwright. Luther Arkwright is by Brian Talbot. It's sort of an epic. Dark Horse published an edition of it. I think it was published by, I don't know if it's self-published, but it was published by somebody before Dark Horse, Valkyrie Press. This is actually the first issue of Valkyrie Press run. And this is an multiverse, alternative universe, sci-fi, fantasy, very dense comic book. Even the approach to the storytelling, you can see different lettering styles, very dense panel layouts. This page in particular stands out to me where he's typesetting some of the lettering. And this is an origin sort of Arkwright's experience coming basically to our reality, or to a different reality, and waking up and trying to acclimate himself to that. So he details kind of living in a library for a couple of days and trying to read as much as he can to catch up, and looking like a homeless person and being hungry and stealing food and things like that. He's running from disruptors who I guess are messing with reality on all these different planes of existence. And, you know, early graphic novel, very ambitious, genre that wasn't really popular in the mid-'80s in terms of comics. You know, they were mostly dominated by superhero comics, and he's doing this big fantasy sci-fi thing. I have not read all of Luther Arkwright. It's one of those comics that the density of it intimidates me, but I am kind of interested. I do think it looks good, and it was cool to find the entire series to pick up. The last comic that I left with was Ron English's Big Top Propaganda. Ron English is kind of a lowbrow artist, celebrated for his paintings and mashups and murals and things of that sort. Apparently, he did a comic book. I did not know this. This is issue number 1, 2011, and it's, you know, it's real comics. It's not just like a zine or a collection of his paintings or anything. It's actual comics. So this was kind of a neat find. I didn't know it existed, like a lot of the books that I pull out of these weird back issue bins, and pretty great to get hold of. I'm very curious to go through this one closer. And that concludes my 232 comics. I did a couple of, I did buy a couple of the same book, but overall, pretty successful trip and a very fun time diving through these comics. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. As always, you can subscribe to our channel below. Be sure and hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any new video uploads. You can leave comments below. Let us know where you like to dig for comics and what are some good books that you have found. You can also support the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel through our merch shop at Spreadshop. There is a link below this video where you can find all of that. And until next time, you know what to do. Read more comics.